The birth of sorrow. 2 million years ago, in the frozen expanses of North America, where endless sheets of ice stretched beyond the horizon and the breath of winter never ceased, a story began that would echo through the corridors of time. In the depths of the harshest winter the continent had ever known, when even the stars seemed to shiver in the obsidian sky, life stirred in the darkness of a small, cramped den. But this was not the joyous emergence of hope that one might expect. No, this birth was the opening curtain of a tragedy so profound, so inevitable, that it would define not just what it meant to be the last of the great predators. Among a litter of trembling bodies, pressed together against the merciless cold, one small form took its first breath of the ancient air. His eyes, sealed shut against a world he did not yet know, would soon open to witness wonders and horrors beyond imagination. This is the story of the last true king of the Ice Age, and the civilization that would ultimately seal his fate. Chapter 1, Eyes of the Innocent. 7 days. 7 endless days of darkness, warmth, and the rhythmic beating of his mother's heart, the only constant in a world of uncertainty. When his eyes finally cracked open for the first time, releasing tiny beams of golden amber light into the shadowy den, what they beheld was not a vast wilderness of legend, but the harsh reality of survival. The den was smaller than one might imagine for creatures destined to become legends. Carved from earth and land, with whatever sparse vegetation their mother could gather, it barely contained the writhing mass of his siblings' 5 other cubs, each fighting for space, for warmth, for the precious milk that meant the difference between life and death. His first clear vision was of his brother's face, pressed close to his own, tiny fangs already beginning to emerge from pink gums. Even in these earliest moments, the design of and destiny was evident. They were born to be predators, shaped by millions of years of evolution into perfect killing machines. Yet in this moment, they were simply fragile, hungry infants utterly dependent on parents who themselves walked the edge of survival. The nights when their parents returned empty-handed from the hunt were lessons in desperation. While still blind to the complexities of their world, the cubs could sense the tension that filled the den like a toxic fog. Their mother's milk would grow thin, her body drawing upon its last reserve. Their father's massive form would curl around the family, but even his impressive impassive bulk could not shield them from the gnawing hunger that began to define their existence. It was during these dark hours that the unnamed cub, for he would not earn a name, until he proved worthy of survival, first learned the fundamental truth of his existence. The world owed him nothing. Every breath was a victory wrested from the jaws of death. Every drop of milk was a treasure more precious than the glittering ice that adorned their den's entrance. As his hearing developed, new sounds filtered into his consciousness. The howling of the wind, yes, but also other, more ominous noises. The roar of distant predators claiming their territory. The thunderous footsteps of massive prey animals moving across the frozen land under tremendous weight. And sometimes, most terrifying of all, silence complete, absolute absence of death, absence of islands and spoke of death that things the wilderness was patient, inexorable. His siblings, he began to notice, were not merely companions, but competitors. When feeding time came, the strongest and most aggressive secured, the weak were pushed aside, forced to content themselves with whatever scraps of nourishment remained. It was a harsh lesson in hierarchy, one that would serve him well in the trials to come. The unnamed cub was not the largest of the litter, nor was he the smallest. He existed in that dangerous middle ground where survival depended not on obvious advantages, but on cunning, timing, and an instinctive understanding of when to fight and when to yield. His golden eyes, growing sharper each day, began to study his family with an intensity that belied his tender age. His mother, he observed, moved with a grace that seemed to defy her massive size. Every muscle was perfectly coordinated, every step calculated for maximum efficiency. When she groomed her cubs, her enormous tongue was capable of surprising gentleness, yet he could feel the power contained within her jaw far enough to crush the skull of any creature that threatened her young. His father was absence and presence in equal measure. Gone for days at a time in pursuit of prey, he would return like a force of nature, filling the den with his overwhelming presence. The cub watched in fascination as his father's jaw opened at impassable angles, revealing canine teeth that seemed to capture and reflect what little light penetrated their refuge. These were the fangs of legend, weapons evolved for a single, terrible purpose. Pierced the thick hide of massive prey, delivered back with surgical precision. And then came the day when the world beyond the den beckoned with irresistible force. His legs, once trembling and uncertain, had grown strong enough to support his increasing weight. His eyes, adapted to the perpetual twilight of the den, were ready to face the brilliant glare of sunlight on ice. The first step outside was a revelation that nearly overwhelmed his developing senses. The world was vast beyond comprehension, stretching in every direction until it merged with a sky so blue it seemed to burn his retinas. The air was clean and sharp, carrying scents that triggered instincts he didn't yet understand, the musk of distant herds, the metallic tang of blood on snow, the green promise of vegetation struggling to survive in this harsh landscape. But it was the cold that truly marked his entry into the real world. It struck him like a physical blow, penetrating his still developing coat and reaching down to his bones. This was not the gentle chill of the den, but the merciless cold of the Ice Age cold that could kill the unwary in minutes, that turned breath to crystalline, made every exhalation a visible reminder of mortality. His mother's massive form provided some shelter as she led her cubs on their first exploration of the immediate territory. Every few steps, she would pause, her head swiveling as she scanned for threats. Her ears, far more sensitive, remained mystery. The faintest traces of scent across vast distances is we analyzed the air for information crucial from our survival. The cubs stayed close, instinctively understanding that the world beyond their mothers' protective shadow was filled with dangers they could not yet comprehend. But curiosity, that fatal trait that would define their species, drew them ever outward. Small adventures became bolder explorations. The den's immediate vicinity became familiar territory, mapped and cataloged in their developing minds. It was during one of these early expeditions that the unnamed cub first witnessed death in its rawest form. A young ground sloth, separated from its herd and weakened by hunger, had collapsed near their territory. The sight of the massive creature, its great claws still twitching in its final moments, sent shock waves through his consciousness. This was prey the sustenance that his family required to survive. Yet seeing it in its death throes, watching the light fade from eyes not so different from his own, sparked something unexpected in his developing mind. Was this what awaited all living things? Was this the ultimate destination of every breath, every heartbeat, every dream of survival? His mother approached the carcass with professional efficiency, her powerful jaws tearing through hide and muscle with practiced ease. The cubs watched, learning through observation the technique they would need to master if they hoped to survive to adulthood. But the unnamed cub found himself fixated not on the feeding technique, but on the sloth face frozen in an expression of what seemed almost like resignation, as if it had accepted its fate long before death claimed it. That night, as the family fed, the cubs experienced their first taste of fresh meat. The unnamed cub could not shake the image of those resigned eyes. Something deep within his consciousness whispered that he was seeing not just the death of prey, but odds of his own distant future. The thought was too large, too terrible for his young mind to fully grasp, but it planted a seed of awareness that would grow with each passing day. The world was beautiful and terrible, full of wonders and horrors in equal measure. And he was no longer just a helpless infant protected by the walls of a den. He was a participant in an ancient drama, playing a role that had been written long before his birth and would continue long after his death. The age of innocence was ending. The education of a predator was about to begin. Chapter 2, Lessons in Blood and Snow. Months passed like seasons in the life of the growing cub, each day bringing new revelations about the intricate dance of survival that governed his world. His body, once soft and vulnerable, began to show the first sign of the magnificent predator he was destined to become. His legs grew longer and more powerful, his shoulders broader, his neck thicker to support the massive skull that housed his developing weapons. But it was his fangs that marked his true transformation. What had begun as tiny needles barely protruding from his gums now grew daily, becoming the curved daggers that would define his species' legacy. Each morning brought the peculiar sensation of their continued emergence, a constant reminder of his genetic destiny. These were not merely teeth, but precision instruments of death, evolved over millions of years for a single specific purpose. His father, recognizing the signs of readiness in his offspring, began the most crucial phase of their education. The lessons would be harsh, unforgiving, and essential. For in the world of the saber-toothed tiger, there was no room for error, no second chances for those who failed to master the ancient arts of the hunt. The first lesson came without warning, as all the most important lessons do. The family had been resting in the afternoon sun when their father suddenly rose, his massive head turning towards some distant stimulus that only he could detect. His nostrils flared as he analyzed complex layers of scent information, his ears swiveling to pinpoint sounds beyond the cub's perception. What followed was a demonstration of hunting prowess that would be seared into the unnamed cub's memory forever. Moving with a silence that seemed impossible for a creature of his size, their father began to stalk prey that remained invisible to his offspring. Every step was calculated, every movement flowing into the next with liquid grace. His massive body, which could appear clumsy in repose, transformed into a machine of perfect efficiency. The prey, when it finally came into view, was a young bison that had wandered too far from the protective mass of its herd. The creature was easily 3 times the weight of their father, armed with horns capable of disemboweling a careless predator, possessed of speed that could carry it beyond reach in seconds. Yet as the cubs watched in fascination and growing understanding, they saw how millions of years of evolution had equipped their father for exactly this moment. The final approach was poetry written in violence. Their father's powerful hindquarters, coiled like compressed springs, every muscle fiber preparing for the explosive burst of speed that would close the distance between predator and prey. His jaw began to open, revealing the terrible majesty of his primary weapon's canine teeth that could penetrate the thickest hide. It could sever the major blood vessels with surgical precision. The attack, when it came, lasted only seconds, but seemed to unfold in slow motion. Their father launched himself through the air, his tremendous weight carrying him forward with unstoppable momentum. The bison, alerted at the last moment, tried to turn and flee, but physics and evolution had already sealed its fate. The impact echoed across the landscape like thunder. The saber-toothed tigers for EC laws evolved to grapple with struggling prey, found their mark on the bison's shoulders, while his hind legs Legs maintained contact with the ground to provide stability. But it was the deployment of those legendary fangs that marked the true moment of death, with precision that spoke of millions of years of evolutionary refinement. Their father's canines penetrated the bison's neck, sliding between vertebrae to sever the spinal cord, while simultaneously puncturing the major arteries. The angle was perfect, the depth calculated with instinctive accuracy. The bison's struggle ceased almost instantly, its massive frame collapsing under the combined effect of paralysis and catastrophic blood loss. The cubs, watching from a safe distance, witnessed not just a successful hunt, but a masterpiece of biological engineering in action. This was what they were born to become, apex predators capable of bringing down prey any times their own size through the perfect application of speed, strength, and those magnificent apple fangs. But observation and execution, as the unnamed cub, were vastly different things. His first hunting lesson came days later, targeting prey more appropriate to his current capabilities, a rabbit that had been caught stealing scraps from a recent kill. The rabbit, frozen in terror at being discovered, seemed an easy target. It was small, unarmed except for its speed, and obviously weakened by hunger. Yet, as the unnamed cub attempted to apply the techniques he had observed, everything went catastrophically wrong. His approach, which seemed silent to his own ears, sounded like an avalanche to the rabbit's sensitive hearing. His attempt at a stealthy crouch resulted in an ungainly stumble that announced his presence at every creature within 100 yards. When he finally launched his attack, his coordination failed him completely. His leap, intended to arc gracefully through the air like his father's, instead sent him tumbling head over heels into a snowbank. The rabbit, apparently as surprised by the cub's incompetence as the cub himself, paused for a moment as if uncertain whether this creature represented any actual threat. Then, with what might have been disdain, it bounded away across the snow, disappearing into the landscape with effortless grace. The humiliation was complete and devastating. The unnamed cub lay in the snowbank, his golden coat now white with powder, his pride shattered like ice in spring. The hunting instincts that should have been his birthright seemed hopelessly beyond his reach. How could he be so perfectly designed for killing, yet so utterly incapable of actually accomplishing it? His father's approach was gentle but firm. There would be no mockery, no harsh criticism, but also no false comfort. The world would not adjust its standards to accommodate failure, no matter how endearing the reason. The only choice was to learn, to improve, to evolve from the mistakes that could mean the difference between life and death. What followed were weeks of intensive training that pushed the young cub to the limits of his physical and mental capabilities. Each day brought new challenges, new opportunities to fail, and new lessons written in frustration and determination. His father was a patient but demanding teacher, demonstrating technique repeatedly. Offspring could at least approximate the required movements. Balance was the first crucial lesson. A saber-toothed tiger's hunting style required perfect coordination between his massive front heavy build and the explosive power of his hindquarters. The famous canines, while devastating weapons, also altered the animal's center of gravity in ways that demanded constant adjustment and compensation. Speed was the second essential element. Their prey animals had evolved their own survival strategies over millions of years, developing senses keen enough to detect predators at great distances and some decision to it just perfectly. One tiger had perhaps one slow tiger had perhaps the close knit knit then knit 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 killing bite that represented the greatest challenge and the highest art of their species. Those magnificent fangs that define their legend were also potential weaknesses if improperly employed. Too shallow and angling, it would fail to penetrate vital structures. Too steepened, they could become lodged in bone, leaving the predator helpless as the prey fought free. The margin for error was measured in degrees and fractions of seconds. Gradually, through repetition and an increasing understanding of his own capabilities, the unnamed cub began to show improvement. His movements coordinated and purposeful. His timing improved until he could predict the precise moment when prey would be most vulnerable to attack. The first successful kill came almost as a surprise. The target was another rabbit, but this time the cub's approach was flawless. His attack perfectly timed. His killing bite delivered with textbook precision. The small creature died instantly, without suffering, which somehow made the victory feel both triumphant and hollow. Standing over his first kill, the unnamed cub experienced a mixture of emotions too complex for his still developing consciousness to fully process. Pride in his accomplishment warred with an unexpected sense of sorrow for the life he had taken. Excitement at proving his confidence battled with the growing of what he was now capable of ending life with calculated efficiency. This was his nature, written into every strand of his DNA by millions of years of evolutionary pressure. Yet something within him rebelled against the simplicity of that explanation. Was he nothing more than a biological machine designed for killing? Or was there something more, some spark of consciousness that elevated his existence beyond mere predation? As his skills developed, the unnamed cub was gradually introduced to the complex social dynamics of pack hunting. While saber-toothed tigers were capable of solitary hunting, the largest prey required coordinated group effort that demanded not just individual skill, but the ability to function as part of a larger organism. The first major hunt he was allowed to observe was a group effort targeting an ancient ground sloth, a creature of such immense size and formidable defensive capabilities that it required the combined efforts of multiple adult predators to bring down safely. The cubs watched from a safe distance as their parents and several other adults engaged in what could only be described as a prehistoric battle heightened. The ground sloth was a living fortress, its massive frame covered in thick hide and protected by claws that could disembowel an attacker with a single swipe. Standing nearly 12 feet, tall and weighing several tons, it represented both an enormous opportunity and an equally enormous risk for the hunting party. The attack, when it came, was a masterpiece of coordination that had been refined over countless similar hunts. Each predator had a specific role. Each movement was timed to complement the others. Each risk was calculated and accepted as part of the larger strategy. The initial assault came from multiple directions simultaneously, preventing the sloth from focusing its formidable defenses on any single threat. Two adults attacked from the front, using their superior speed and agility to stay beyond the reach of those devastating claws, while forcing the massive creature to rear up on its hind legs, exposing its vulnerable undersides. From the flanks, other members of the hunting party darted in to deliver precise strikes to the sloth's legs, seeking to damage the tendons and muscles that supported its enormous weight. Each attack was a calculated risk. A closing those claws could end the predator's life in an instant, stay too far away and fail to inflict meaningful damage. But it was the final phase of the attack that truly demonstrated the evolutionary perfection of the saber-toothed tiger's hunting strategy. With the sloth's mobility compromised and its attention divided among multiple threats, the largest and most experienced hunter moved in for the killing blow. The death bite, when it came, was delivered with the precision of a surgeon and the power of an avalanche. Those legendary fangs penetrated the sloth's neck at exactly the right angle, severing both spinal cord and carotid arteries in a single devastating strike. The massive creature, which had seemed invincible just moments before, collapsed with a sound like falling timber. The cubs, watching this display of coordinated lethality, began to understand that their education had only just begun. Individual hunting skills were merely the foundation for something far more complex and demanding. To truly master their predatory heritage, they would need to learn not just how to kill, but how to kill as part of a team, how to push their pack mates with their lives, how to sacrifice individual glory for collective success. That night, as the extended family fed on the massive carcass, the unnamed cub studying the faces of the adults around him. Each bore the scars of previous hunts, claw marks, old bite-wounds, patches of fur that had grown back wide over healed injuries. These were the cost the prices paid for mastery of their chosen profession. Yet there was something else in their expressions, as they say, something that went beyond mere satisfaction at a successful hunt. There was a kind of grim acceptance, as if they understood that each victory brought them one step closer to their own inevitable defeat. They were ex-predators, master of their domain, yet something in their eyes suggested they knew that this mastery was temporary, that the world was changing in ways they could not control or comprehend. The unnamed cub, still too young to fully understand the implications of what he was seeing, nevertheless felt the first stirrings of a deeper awareness. The skills he was learning, the instincts he was developing, the very nature of his existence, all of it was part of something larger. Something that stretched back through millions of years and forward into an uncertain future. The education of a predator was more than learning to hunt and kill. It was learning to live with the knowledge that in nature, every victory was temporary, every strength could become a weakness, and every species, no matter how perfectly adapted, carried within itself the seeds of its own obsolescence. But such philosophical concerns were still beyond his reach. For now he was content to feed and grow strong, to practice his skills and prepare for the independence that awaited him. The future, with all its dangers and revelations, remained safely distant, or so he believed. Chapter 3, The Great Hunt in the Bonds of Blood. The seasons turned with the inexorable rhythm of an ancient world, and with each passing month, the unnamed cub grew closer to the magnificent predator he was destined to become. His body filled out with powerful muscles. His coordination improved until his movements flowed like liquid death, and his fangs continued their steady emergence, each day bringing them closer to their full, terrible glory. But it was in his second year of life that he would witness something that would forever change his understanding of what it meant to be a saber-toothed tiger. Word had spread through the scattered family groups that shared the territory prey of unprecedented size had been spotted moving through their domain. Not just any prey, but a creature of legend, a giant ground sloth of such immense proportions that it would require the cooperation of every available predator to bring down. The preparation for this hunt took on an almost ritualistic quality. Family groups that normally maintained fearful distances from one another began to converge, their territorial boundaries temporarily forgotten in the face of an opportunity that might not come again for years. The unnamed cub watched in fascination as his mate employed social negotiation complex, establishing the hierarchy and coordination that would be anchor for success. When he finally laid eyes on the target of their collective ambition, the unnamed cub understood why there's such excitement in preparation. The giant ground sloth was easily the largest land creature he had ever seen, a walking mountain of muscle, hide, and bone that seemed to dwarf everything around it. Standing nearly 15 feet tall and weighing several tons, it moved across the landscape with the ponderous dignity of a political formation given. Its very existence seemed to mock the efforts of individual predators. What could a single saber-wide tiger, no matter how skilled, hope to accomplish against such a massive target? The creature's hide was thick enough to turn aside all but the most perfectly placed attacks. Its claw large enough to disembowel a horse with a casual swipe. Its... not sufficient. No. 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 Yet as the hunting party assembled, the unnamed cub began to understand the true power of coordinated predation. This was no mere collection of individual hunters, but a precision instrument forged by millions of years of evolutionary pressure. Each adult knew exactly what was expected of them. Each movement had been refined through countless similar encounters. Each strategy had been tested against the most formidable prey the Ice Age had offered. The hunting party numbered nearly 20 adults, an unprecedented gathering that represented the combined strength of multiple family groups. Among them were legendary hunters whose reputations had spread throughout the territory, scarred veterans who had survived encounters that would have killed lesser predators, and rising young adults eager to prove themselves worthy of such company. The attack, when it finally came, unfolded like a symphony of violence choreographed by natural selection itself. The giant sloth, despite itself facing opponents who had been specifically designed by evolution to hunt creatures exactly like it. Every aspect of saber-wide anatomy and behavior had been refined for this precise moment. The ability to coordinate complex group attacks, the speed necessary to avoid not indefensive weapons, the speed necessary to avoid massive unspotted struggling prey in any hands their own size, and those might not their own size. The initial phase involved establishing control of the battlefield, forcing the sloth into a position where its formidable defensive capabilities would be minimized. Using their superior speed and coordination, the hunting party began to circle their massive target, staying just beyond the reach of those devastating claws, or gradually wearing down its stamina and morale. The sloth, recognizing the nature of the threat it faced, reared up on its hind legs in an attempt to present the most intimidating possible profile. Standing at its full height, with its massive claws extended and its cavernous mouth open in a roar that shook the very ground, it truly resembled some primordial deity in destruction. For a moment, even the experienced hunters seemed to hesitate, awed by the sheer magnitude of their chosen adversary. But hesitation was a luxury they could not afford. As one, the hunting party launched their coordinated assault, each predator moving to their assigned position with the precision of a military formation. The frontalists all team engaged the sloth's attention, using their agility to stay mobile while forcing it to expend energy in defensive maneuvers. Meanwhile, the flanking groups moved in from the sides, seeking opportunities to damage the massive creature's legs and compromise its mobility. The battle that followed would have seemed mythical to any observer. Sabered wall-and hiders flew through the air like arrows, their powerful muscles propelling them in arcing leaps that carried them over the sloth's defensive sweeps. The sound of combat echoed across the landscape, the thunder of massive feet striking the ground, the whistle's claws cutting through air, the sharp crack of impact at prey in a test of evolutionary design. For the unnamed cub, watching from a safe distance, the battle was a revelation that went far beyond mere hunting technique. This was its heritage made manifest, the culmination of millions of years of evolutionary pressure that had shaped his species into the most effective large prey hunters the world had ever seen. Every movement of the adult hunter spoke to genetic memories encoded in his own DNA, instinct were only now beginning to stir in his consciousness. He could feel his body responding to the sight of the hunt, muscles tensing in anticipation, fangs aching with the desire to join the attack. The unnamed cub was witnessing not just a successful predation event, but the very essence of what it meant to be a saber-toothed tiger. This was why they evidently just the most specialized killing weapon their jaws, the most specialized killing weapons in the animal kingdom. The end, when it came, was both anticlimactic and transcendent. After what seemed like hours of coordinated assault, the giant's loot finally began to fail. Its movements became slower, less coordinated, as exhaustion and accumulated injury, as exhaustion and party, bleeding the signs with predatory and took the close in for the final phase of their attack. The killing blow was delivered by the lead hunter, the most experienced and powerful member of the group. With the sleuth's attention focused on multiple threats, he managed to close the distance and deliver a perfect strike neck precisely. The right angle massive creature's neck at precisely the right angle, a severable spinal cord and major blood vessels, The giant that had seemed invincible this moment enough for Nandisable. Not with tremendous. Oh, so. No. Now, that's. What followed was a feeding frenzy unlike anything the unnamed cub had ever witnessed. The massive carcass provided enough meat to feed the entire hunting party for days, with enough left over to attract territory. For the first time in his young life, the cub experienced what it meant to eat until completely satisfied, to feed without the constant anxiety about when the next meal might come. But the hunt's significance went far beyond mere sustenance. This was a triumph that would be remembered and recalled for generations, a demonstration of cooperative formation at its absolute finest. The adult hunters moved among one another with a camaraderie born of shared danger and collective success, grooming each other's wounds, sharing choice portions of meat, reinforcing the social bonds that made such cooperation possible. Yet, even as the unnamed cub basked in the glory of this ancestral achievement, changes were stirring within his own family that would soon alter the course of his life. His mother's behavior had begun to shift in subtle ways that spoke to new priorities and responsibilities. She spent more time tending, less time participating in hunts, and her appetite had decreased despite the abundance of food available from their epic abundance of food of their epic. The signs were unmistakable to those who knew how to read them. New life was stirring within the family den, siblings who would soon compete for the same resources, the same opportunities for survival that had shaped his own development. The unnamed cub watched his mother's changing silhouette with a mixture of excitement and growing in eyes. When the new litter finally arrived for tiny, blind, helpless creatures, the family dynamic shifted with dramatic suddenness. Resources that had once seemed adequate were now stretched to the breaking point. Territory that had supported one generation of cubs was suddenly insufficient for two. The adults, faced with the fundamental imperative to ensure the survival of their gene, began making the harsh calculations that governed life in the wild. The unnamed cub, no longer the youngest or most vulnerable member of the family, found himself in an increasingly precarious position. While still not fully adult, he was large enough to represent competition for resources that were desperately needed by his smaller siblings. His presence as a sign of the family's success now posed a threat to the survival of the newest generation. The signs of his impending exile were subtle at first, slight coolness in his parents' behavior, reduced access to the choicest portions of kills, gentle but firm redirections when he attempted to enter certain areas of the den. But the unnamed cub, now nearly 2 years old and possessed of intelligence serpent by constant survival challenges, understood what these changes meant. The family that had been his entire world, the only source of security and affection he had ever known, was preparing to cast him out into the wilderness to make his own way. It was not cruelty that drove this decision, but the inexorable logic of survival. In a world where resources were always limited had their breaking points, the knowledge of his coming exile filled the unnamed cub with emotions too complex for his still developing consciousness to fully process. Fear dominated his thoughts, fear of the vast wilderness that lay beyond the protection of family, a fear of the established predators who would eat the prey, fear of the starvation that claimed so many young tigers who failed establish themselves successful. But alongside the fear was something else. Something that spoke to the independent nature that had been bred into his species over millions of years. A part of him, the part that carried the genetic memories of countless solitary hunters, yearned for the freedom that exile would bring. No longer would he need to share trails of the hierarchy of family structure. No longer would he need to defer to the hierarchy of family, depend on the decisions and capabilities of others. His last hunt as a member of the family was a bittersweet affair. The target was a young bison, large enough to require coordinated effort, but small enough that his participation was genuinely valuable rather than merely tolerated. For one final time, he moved in perfect synchronization with his parents' undoubted siblings, contributing his strength and skill to the collective effort that had defined his existence since Earth. The kill was clean and efficient, a textbook example of saber-toothed, a tiger hunting technique that left the prey dead within seconds when the predators uninjured. As the family friend with them tried to memorize every detail of the taste of fresh blood, the warmth of his siblings pressed against him, the rumbling purr of contentment from his mother, as she watched her offspring feed. The end, when it came, was marked by neither ceremony nor drama. His father simply looked at him with eyes that held both love and implacable determination, and the unnamed cub understood that the moment had arrived. There would be no tearful farewells, no promises of future reunions, no gradual transition to independence. The law of the wild was simple and absolute when time came to leave. He left. Rising from the kill site, the unnamed cub took one last look at the family that had shaped him, taught him, and prepared him for this moment. His parents watched with expressions that reveal nothing of the emotional cost of this separation. His younger siblings, still too small to understand what was happening, continued feeding with the single-minded focus of the very young. Then he turned and walked away, each step carrying him further from everything he had ever known and closer to a future that held both terrifying uncertainty and infinite possibility. Behind him, the sounds of his family gradually faded until they were indistinguishable from the other noises of the wilderness. Ahead lay the vast expanse of Ice Age North America, a landscape filled with opportunities but the unnamed cub, for he was still unnamed, would remain unnamed until he proved worthy of a title through his own accomplishments, was now truly alone for the first time in his life. The education of a predator had prepared him for this moment, but no amount of preparation could fully ease the terror and exhilaration of stepping into the unknown. He had been born into tragedy, raised in hardship, educated in violence, and now cut out to face the world with nothing but his own strength and cunning. Yet somewhere within his powerful frame, in the depths of his predatory soul, burned a spark of something that transcended mere survival. Whether it was hope, determination, or simply the stubborn refusal to surrender that characterized his species, it would carry him forward into whatever trials awaited. The great hunt was over. The bonds of blood had been severed. The path of solitude stretched ahead, like an uncharted river, full of rapids and hidden dangers, but also flowing toward destinations unknown and perhaps wonderful. His real story was about to begin. Chapter 4, The Terrible Freedom of Solitude. The first night alone was a revelation of vulnerability that struck the young saber-toothed, at times like a physical blow. Without the reassuring presence of adult vigilance, without the familiar scents and sounds that had defined sincerity and sounds that had defined sincerity and every sound that penetrated the night carried potential threat. The howl of distant wolves suggested competitors who might challenge him for territory he had not yet learned in natural hazards that could break an iceberg of environmental hazards that could trap or crush the unwary. Most terrifying of all, the silence between sound left up space for his imagination to populate the dark with dangers both real and phantom. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and frequently interrupted. His body, accustomed to the warmth provided by his family, struggled to maintain temperature in the bitter cold of late autumn. His mind, lacking the comfort of familiar presences, remained hyper-alert to every stimulus that might signal approaching danger. Dawn found him exhausted, hungry, and profoundly aware that his survival now depended entirely on capabilities. The first attempts at solitary hunting revealed just how dependent he had become on the coordinated efforts of his family. Prey that had seemed easily manageable when approached by multiple predators now appeared formidably dangerous when faced alone. A single deer, which might have provided an easy kill for a hunting party, became a complex tactical challenge when he had no one help petition the animal or distract the deer in his approach. His initial failures were both humbling and educational. Stalks that seemed perfect were ruined by a moment's inattention to wind direction, allowing his scent to reach his target and send it fleeing before he could close the distance. Attacks that should have succeeded were foiled by his inexperience in solo combat tactics, leaving him with nothing but frustration and an empty stomach. Hunger became his constant companion, a gnawing presence that affected not just his physical capabilities, but his mental state as well. The abundance he had known during the Great Hunt now seemed like a dream from another lifetime. Each day without a successful kill weakened him further, making the next hunt more difficult and the next failure more devastating. The psychological effects of prolonged hunger were perhaps even more destructive than the physical ones. Doubt began to creep into his consciousness, doubt about his abilities, his training, his very worthiness to carry on the genetic legacy of his species. Had his family been wrong to cast him out? Was he simply too weak, too slow, too fundamentally flawed to survive as a solitary predator? It was desperation that drove him to seek out his older brothers, who had been exiled from the family in previous seasons and were struggling with their own challenges of independent survival. The reunion was awkward and tinged with mutual wariness. They were no longer family members, but potential competitors for the same limited resources. Yet necessity overcame suspicion, and for a brief time, they formed an uneasy alliance. 3 young predators, each possessing skills but lacking the experience to use them effectively, pooling their abilities in the hope that cooperation might succeed where individual effort had failed. The alliance achieved what none of them could accomplish alone. Working together, they managed to bring down prey that would have been impossible for any individual to tackle. A young mammoth, separated from its herd during a blizzard, fell victim to their coordinated assault. For several days, they fed like kings, their bellies full for the first time since leaving the family territory. But, even in success, the seeds of the Alliance's destruction were already germinating. The temporary nature of their cooperation became apparent as soon as the immediate crisis of starvation was resolved. With their stomachs full and their immediate survival assured, the three brothers reburdened them over millions of years. The dispute began over the choicest portions of their kill, escalated through arguments over hunting strategy, and exploded into violence when the question of territorial boundaries arose. What had begun as a collaboration between equals devolved into a dominant struggle between rivals who understood that only one could ultimately claim the territory they had collectively defended. The fight, when it came, was both inevitable and heartbreaking. These were not strangers meeting in combat over resources, but brothers who had played together as cubs, learned together as juveniles, and dreamed together of the day when they would prove themselves worthy of their genetic heritage. Yet the logic of survival admitted no sentiment, no mercy, no consideration for bonds that had been forged in a gentler time. The battle was brief but decisive. Superior size and experience gave the eldest brother an advantage that skill and determination could not overcome. The unnamed cub found himself bloodied, defeated, and once again cast out into the wilderness, this time not by loving parents making a difficult decision, but by a sibling who had chosen an individual survival over familial bonds. Wounded in both body and spirit, he limped away from the territory that had briefly seemed like salvation. The lesson was harsh but unambiguous. In the world of the saber-toothed tiger, there was ultimately no one to rely on but yourself. Family, alliance, cooperation all were temporary conveniences that would be abandoned the moment lifted with the fundamental imperative of individual survival. What followed were weeks that tested the very limits of his endurance. Alone, injured, and increasingly desperate, he wandered through territories controlled by predators more experienced and better established than himself. Each encounter was a potential death sentence. He was too weak to fight effectively, conspicuous to hide successfully, and too proud to submit to the dominance of rivals. The winter deepened around him like a closing fist, each day bringing new challenges to his survival. Food became increasingly scarce as prey animals migrated toward more territories or dandy for the season. The cold, which had once been merely uncomfortable, now posed a constant threat-created cloud that could reveal his excursion's colored prey, and the frozen ground made silent hacking nearly impossible. Yet adversity, that most demanding teacher, began to work its transformative magic. Each failure taught him lessons that success never could. Each near-death experience stripped away another layer of youthful illusion, replacing naive confidence with hard-earned wisdom. His body, pushed to its absolute limit, began to grow stronger, more efficient, more perfectly inducted to the demands of solitary vegetation. His muscles, already impressive by genetic design, hardened into cables of living steel. His reflexes, sharpened by constant danger, became supernaturally quick. His senses, overwhelmed by the need to detect both opportunity and threat, developed to a level of supernatural. Most importantly, his mind began to develop a calculating intelligence that prevented successful predators from evolution's evolutionary failures. The transformation was as much psychological as physical. The desperate youngster who had relied on family cooperation and brotherly alliance was being replaced by something harder, more self-sufficient, infinitely more dangerous. Where once he had sought comfort in the presence of others, he now found strength in solitude. Where once he had feared the unknown, he now saw opportunity for those bold enough to seize it. His hunting technique evolved from the straightforward tactics he humbly remembered to sophisticated strategies designed for solitary success. He learned to read terrain like a map, identifying the locations where prey would be vulnerable and predators would be advantaged. He developed an almost supernatural ability to predict, understand his target, the behavior of potential target hunters, their psychological patterns as well. The breakthrough came during a late winter hunt that would test every skill he had developed during his months of solitary struggle. The target was a mature bisunbull, a creature that represented both tremendous opportunity and equally tremendous risk. Success would provide enough food to sustain him for weeks. Failure could easily result in his death. The bull was everything a predator both desired and feared in potential prey. Massive beyond the capacity of normal tactics to address, armed with horns that could disembowel with a single thrust, possessed of speed that could carry it beyond reach in seconds, and experienced enough to recognize the signs of predator's approach. It was the kind of target that required not just skill and strength, but the kind of evolved intelligence that separated high-tech target to a from. The stalk took hours, each movement calculated not just for immediate advantage, but for its effect on every phase of the attack that would follow. Wind direction, terrain features, escape routes, and that of plant, every variable was considered and incorporated into a strategy of such complexity that it seemed almost mathematical in its precision. The young saber-toothed tiger had become something his family might not have recognized, a creature of pure predatory intention. Every aspect of his being focused on the single goal of bringing down prey that exceeded his own weight by a factor of 3. This was no longer the uncertain cub who had stumbled over his own feet in pursuit of rabbits, but a perfected killing machine operating at the very peak of evolutionary design. The attack, when it finally came, was poetry written in violence and blood. Every element came together with clockwork precision, approach angle calculated to avoid the bull's peripheral vision, timing synchronized with its natural movement patterns, speed perfectly modulated to close the distance before defensive reactions could take effect. The killing bite was delivered with surgical precision, those legendary fangs penetrating exactly where millions of years of evolutionary refinement had programmed them to strike. Spinal cord severed, carotid arteries opened. The mathivore fully understood that it was under attack. The entire sequence from the moment of decision to the prey's final heartbeat lasted less than 10 seconds. Standing over his kill, the nameless predator experienced emotions too complex for simple categorization. Pride in his accomplishment was mixed with a kind of existential loneliness that no amount of success could fully address. He had proven himself capable of surviving and thriving in the heart and eye, yet that very stress had transformed him into very Mary would no longer no he was no longer the family member who had once depended on others for survival and identity. Nor was he the desperate exile who had briefly sought refuge in alliance with his brothers. He had become something new, a fully realized predator whose capabilities were matched by few and exceeded by none, yet whose very excellence had isolated him from the connections that made existence more than mere survival. The successful hike worked more than just the acquisition of food. It represented his graduation into the ranks of established predators worthy of claiming and defending territory. The location of his kill, a natural valley with outside lines and multiple water sources, possessed all the characteristics of prime hunting ground. For the first time since his exile, he began to think beyond immediate survival to longer-term planning. Establishing territory required more than simply occupying space. It demanded the ability to defend that space against all challengers. Other predators, drawn by the scent of his successful hunt, began to test his resolving capabilities. Each confrontation was a potential death sentence, yet each successful defense enhanced his claim to the resources he had chosen to protect. As winter finally began to loosen its grip on the landscape, the nameless predator surveyed the domain he had carved out through blood and determination. He had achieved something that seemed impossible during those first desperate nights of exile. He had not merely survived, but thrived, transforming himself from a dependent youngster into an capable of competing with the most established hunters in the territory. Yet success brought its own challenges and revelations. The very capabilities that had enabled his survival had also isolated him from the social connections that were as much a part of his species' heritage as their legendary fangs. He was strong enough to face any challenge alone, yet the loneliness of solitary existence gnawed at him with a persistence that no amount of successful hunting could fully satisfy. The territory he had claimed was rich in resources and strategically efficient, but it was also vast and empty, lacking the presence that would transform a hunting ground to something that might be called home. He was a king without subjects, a predator without equals, a magnificent creature operating at the very peak of his species' capabilities, yet increasingly aware that excellence without companionship was a hollow achievement. Spring was coming, bringing with it changes that would challenge his hard-won independence in ways he could not yet imagine. The solitude that had shaped him, strengthened him, and ultimately defined him was about to be tested by forces more powerful than hunger, cold, or rival predators. The season of mating was approaching, and with it, the possibility that his carefully constructed world of splendid isolation might be forever changed. Chapter 5, Love in the Land of Ice and Shadows. Spring arrived like a whispered promise, bringing with it changes that went far beyond the mere warming of air or the gradual retreat of ice from the landscape. For the unnamed predator, now established in his hard-won territory and secure in his mastery of the hunting arts, the changing sea and awakened instincts that had lain dormant during the long struggle for survival. Something deeper than hunger stirred within his powerful frame, maybe, that the successful hunting could not satisfy the loneliness that no amount of territorial dominance could attach. The scents carried on the warming air spoke of possibilities that transcended the simple cycle of predation and survival. Mixed with the familiar odors of prey animals and rival predators was something else. Something that triggered responses written deep in his genetic code. The mating season was beginning, and with it came the promise of an end to the isolation that had defined his existence since leaving his family. His territory, once merely a collection of hunting grounds on defensive positions, began to take on new significance as a potential home that might be shared rather than endured in solitude. The valley he had claimed through blood and determination possessed all the qualities that would appeal to potential made abundant water, good hunting, defensible boundaries, and the kind of varying terrain that could support not just two adult taters, but perhaps, eventually, the next guy. Perhaps she appeared like a manifestation of his deepest hopes, materializing from the morning mist with the fluid grace that marked her as a predator of exceptional quality. Her coat was the color of autumn leaves touched by frost, marked with patterns that seemed to have been painted by an artist of supernatural skill. But it was her eyes that truly captured it, attention golden depths that held intelligence, strength, and a wild yet that matched his own. He had encountered other females during his wanderings, but this one was different. Where others had seemed to view him as either threat or opportunity, she regarded him with the calm assessment of an equal. Her posture spoke of confidence earned through trials similar to his own. Her scars told stories of battles fought and won. Her very presence announced that she was no desperate exile seeking protection, but a successful predator in her own right, capable of choosing her companions based on merit rather than necessity. The courtship that followed was unlike anything in his previous experience. It was not the simple dominance display he had witnessed between his parents, nor the desperate alliance seeking he had attempted with his brothers. This was a complex negotiation between equals, each assessing the other's capabilities, temperament, and potential as a long-term partner. Their first hunt together was both a test and a revelation. Working in coordination for the first time since his exile, he discovered that partnership with a skilled equal could elevate predation to an art form previously beyond his imagination. Where his solitary hunting had been efficient and deadly, their combined effort achieved a level of precision and activeness that seemed almost a connection. She moved like liquid shadow, her timing so perfectly synchronized with his that they tend to share a single consciousness. When he moved about the prey toward her position, she was already in place, waiting with the patience of geological time. When she initiated an attack, he supported her effort to maneuver that scene and circulatory rather than banners. Together, they formed a hunting partnership that transformed the hunting art into something approaching perfection. As days turned to weeks, their relationship deepened beyond mere hunting efficiency. She possessed a playful nature that drew responses from parts of his personality that had been dormant since cubhood. Their rest periods became filled with the kind of companionable, grooming, ungentle wrestling that strengthened bonds while reinforcing their individual capabilities. He learned that her name was Haka, a designation she had earned through deeds that had become legend among the scattered predator communities of the region. Her story, revealed gradually through their growing intimacy, spoke of challenges overcome and rivals defeated, of territories claimed and defended, of a life lived with the same uncompromising excellence that had shaped his own development. Together they began to expand their territorial claims, pushing boundaries that had been established through his solitary efforts into new areas that could support their combined needs. Their hunting success reached levels that exceeded what either could have achieved alone, allowing them to tackle prey that would have been impossibly dangerous for a single predator. The massive mammoth herds that had once seemed beyond reach became viable targets for their coordinated assaults. Working together, they developed strategies of such complexity and effectiveness that they could bring down adult mammoths without sustaining significant injuries, achievements that enhanced their reputation throughout the territory and discouraged potential challengers from testing their dominance. Their shared den became something more than a mere shelter. It evolved into a home in the truest sense, a place where the solitary predators could find comfort in companionship and strength in unity. Haka brought to their domestic arrangements an attention to intense comfort that transformed a functional space he had carved out and actually invited relaxation and contentment. The den's location, chosen originally for its defensive advantages, proved equally well suited for the more complex needs of a mated pair. Multiple chambers provided space for different activities, all carefully positioned entrances offered both security and escape route. The surrounding territory, rich in plant water sources, seemed almost the eyes of potentially the offspring of what presents the ultimate The changes in Hata's behavior were subtle at first, perceptible only to someone who had grown to know her as intimately as he had. Her appetite shifted, her hunting style became more cautious. Her attention to den preparation took on an intensity that spoke of purposes beyond mere comfort. When understanding finally dawned, it brought with it emotions of such complexity that his predatory mind struggled to process them. The prospect of offspring represented both the culmination of their partnership and its ultimate test. Cubs would mean responsibility beyond anything either of them had previously experienced, vulnerability that would persist for years, and the need to think not just about immediate survival but about legacy, continuity, and the future of their genetic line. Their preparation for parenthood transformed every aspect of their existence. Hunting became not just a matter of satisfying their own nutritional needs, but of accumulating reserves that would sustain Haka during the vulnerable period when she would be confined to the den with newborns. Territory that had once seemed adequate suddenly required expansion and fortification to ensure the safety of cubs who would be helpless for months. The psychological preparation was perhaps even more demanding than the physical arrangements. Both had been shaped by lives of independence and self-reliance. The prospect of being responsible for utterly dependent offspring required a fundamental shift in perspective that challenged everything they had learned about survival priorities. During this period of preparation, their hunting partnership reached levels of effectiveness that seemed to transcend the merely physical. They moved together with such perfect coordination that observers might have mistaken them for a single organism with two bodies. Their success rate approached absolute perfection. No prey escaped once they had committed kill untended without meat to show for their efforts. The massive ground sluts that had once required the combined efforts of entire family groups fell to their coordinated assaults. Mammoth cows, protected by the fierce devotion of their mothers in the presence of entire herds, were isolated and taken with surgical precision. Even the most dangerous prey, the giant short-faced bears whose size and ferocity made them rivals rather than victims, learned to avoid territory that bore the scent markers of the ordinary hunting pair. For a time, that seemed suspended outside the normal flow of existence. They lived in a state of perfection that neither had dared to imagine during their respective and a solitary struggle. Their territory was secure, their hunting supremely successful, their bonds strengthened daily by shared challenges and mutual support. They had achieved something that the harsh logic of Ice Age survival made nearly impossible. Genuine happiness in a world where contentment was usually the prelude to that. Their cubs, when they finally arrived, were perfect expressions of their combined genetic heritage. Strong, healthy, and possessed of the kind of vitality that spoke to successful breeding by superior parents, they represented hope for the future in its most tangible form. Watching Haka with their offspring, seeing her fierce protectiveness tempered by gentle nurturing, filled him with emotions that his solitary past had never prepared him to experience. Yet, even in the depths of their domestic bliss, subtle signs of change began to manifest in ways minor that caused immediate concern but significant enough to register in consciousness of to get the earliest warnings of danger. The weather pattern, a migration to than previous in levels of major species, minor variations, and the behavior of other species displayed danger that collectively suggestive of larger distant environment. The hunting remained excellent. Their territory remained secure. Their cubs continued to thrive. But something indefinable had changed in the world around them. Something that registered more as feeling than fact, more as unease than understanding. It was as if the very fabric of their existence had developed tiny imperfections that were spreading outward like cracks in ice subjected. The signs, when they began to appear, were so alien to their experience that their significance was not immediately apparent. Strange scents that belonged to no known species, markings on trees that followed no natural pattern, sounds that spoke of intelligence but possessed characteristics unlike any they had encountered. These anomalies were scattered, intermittent, easy to dismiss as curiosities in a world full of mystery. But gradually, the anomalies began to increase in frequency and coherence, suggesting not random oddities, but the systematic presence of something new in their territory. Something that moved with purpose, left deliberate, lying possessed capabilities that they know any category, their evolutionary experience that both feared them but understand them to understand. Standing together on a ridge overlooking their domain, with their cubs playing safely in the den below and their territory stretching to the horizon in all directions, they seemed to embody the very pinnacle of predatory success. They had overcome every challenge that nature could devise, adapted to every threat that evolution had prepared them to face, and created a partnership that elevated both of them beyond what either could have achieved alone. Yet something in the quality of the light, the texture of the air, the subtle harmonics of sound carrying across the landscape suggested that their world was balanced on the edge of transformation. The age of the great predators was approaching its twilight, though they had no way to comprehend such vast temporal concepts. They knew only that they were happy, successful, and more deeply connected to each other and their environment than either had ever dared to hope. The future stretched ahead like uncharted territory, full of the promise that had sustained them through their individual struggles and collective triumphs. But they could not know that forces beyond their understanding were already in motion, that changes were coming that would challenge not just their individual survival, but the very continuity of their species. For now, there was only the present moment, the warmth of companionship, the satisfaction of successful predation, the joy of offspring that carried their genetic legacy into an uncertain future. They were living at the very peak of what it meant to be saber-toothed tigers, unaware that they were also witnessing the beginning of the end of everything their kind had ever known. The golden age was ending, though the shadows had not yet grown long enough to be visible to those who lived within its light. Chapter 6. The Strange Newcomers. The first signs of their presence were so subtle that they might have been dismissed as natural phenomena by creatures less attuned to the intricate patterns of their environment. A scent here, too complex and layered to belong to any known species. A sound there, rhythmic and purposeful in ways that suggested intelligence, but possessed characteristics that fit no category in their pet experience. Markings on trees that followed geometric patterns never seen in nature. Arrangements of phones and posts that spoke of intention. For weeks, these anomalies remained scattered and intermittent. Curiosity that registered in their consciousness, but posed no apparent threat to their dominance. Their hunting continued to be supremely successful. Their territory remained successful. Their cubs grew stronger each day. As something indefinible had changed in the quality of their environment, as if familiar territory had been subtly altered by the presence of something that did not belong. The unnamed predator found himself paying closer attention to details that had previously been background noise in the symphony of wilderness life. The flight patterns of birds seemed slightly different, following routes that avoided certain areas for no apparent reason. Small prey animals displayed nervousness that went beyond their normal wariness of predators, clustering in unusual formations underneath traditional feeding grounds without obvious cause. Haka, whose senses had been sharpened by the protective instinct of new motherhood, was the first to recognize that these changes were not random fluctuations, but evidence of systematic intrusion by something previer began to display the heightened vigilance that spoke of a predator who had detected the presence of potential threat to her offspring. Their hunting expeditions, once undertaken with the casual confidence of apex predators operating in familiar territory, now required constant attention to subtle signs that suggested they were no longer the only intelligent hunters in the region. Tracks appeared that belonged to no known species too large for any existing predator's paws, yet displaying toe arrangements that suggested neither hoof nor claw but something entirely different. The evidence accumulated slowly, but inexorably, each new discovery adding weight to the growing realization that their world was being invaded by something unprecedented. Cleared areas appeared in dense forests, created through methods that left no evidence of natural processes like fire or storm damage. Straight lines appeared in the landscape where none had existed before, following routes that seemed... Most disturbing of all were the remains of kills that bore characteristics like anything in their experience. Prey animals had been butchered using techniques that spoke of intelligence until use, but the methods employed were so different from natural predation that they seemed almost ritualistic in their precision. Hide had been removed with cuts to clean for claws or teeth. Bones had been split with impossible accuracy. Meat had been split with impossible accuracy. Meat had impossible accuracy. Meat had been told us in full consumption. The psychological impact of these discoveries was perhaps more unsettling than their immediate practical implications. Throughout their lives, both predators had operated according to rules established over millions of years of evolutionary development. Prey behaved in predictable ways. Competitors followed understood patterns. Environmental changes occurred according to natural cycles that could be anticipated. But these new developments followed no pattern in their experience, suggested capabilities that challenged everything they understood about the natural order, and implied the presence of intelligence operating according to principles that were not just different but fundamentally alien to their predatory worldview. Their response was to intensify their territorial vigilance and defensive preparations in ways that went far beyond their normal precautions. The den that had served as a comfortable home was restructured to provide multiple escape routes and defensive positions. Their hunting patterns were modified to avoid areas where the strange signs were most concentrated, even when this meant foregoing access to prime populations. Most significantly, they began to take turns maintaining constant watch over their territory, with one parent always remaining near the den, while the other conducted the scouting and hunting necessary for their survival. This represented a fundamental shift in their operational efficiency, reducing their hunting effectiveness while increasing their defensive capability in response to a threat they could go yet fully understand. The first direct visual contact came without warning. During what should have been a routine hunt in territory they had considered absolutely secure. The unnamed predator had been tracking a young deer through familiar woodland when movement in his peripheral vision caught his action movement that was wrong in ways his predatory instincts recognized even before his conscious mind could process the details. What he saw challenged every assumption he had made about the nature of the intruders. These were not massive predators whose size might explain their impact on the environment, nor were they swift prey animals whose speed could account for their ability to avoid detection. They were strange, a bright creature that moved with an awkward gait like anything in its experience, yet displayed coordination and purpose that spoke of intelligence. There were several of them, moving together in a formation that suggested both cooperation and hierarchy. Their bodies were poorly designed for wilderness survival, lacking the thick fur necessary for temperature regulation. The claws needed for climbing or digging, the powerful jaws required for processing food, the speed essential for either pursuing prey or escaping predators. Yet they carried objects that extended their capabilities in ways that seemed to defy natural law. The sticks they bore were to straighten uniform to be natural wood, modified in ways that suggested to use far beyond anything he had witnessed in other species. Some of these implements had sharp points that gleamed with unnatural regularity. Others possessed features that served no obvious purpose, but appeared to be deliberately crafted rather than accidentally acquired. What disturbed him most profoundly was not their appearance, strange though it was, but their behavior. They moved through the environment not as creatures adapted to it, but as beings who expected it to adapt to them. They showed no deference to the established territorial markers that govern relationships between predator species, no apparent awareness that they were trespassing in domain that had been claimed and defended through blood and violence. Most unsettling of all was their apparent lack of fear. Every creature in his experience, from the most formidable predators to the most defenseless prey, showed appropriate respect for the presence of a saber-toothed tiger. These strange beings seemed utterly indifferent to his proximity, as if they either failed to recognize him as a threat or possessed confidence in their ability to deal with any danger he might represent. For long moments, predator and intruders regarded each other across a distance that represented the boundary between two entirely different categories of existence. He had encountered countless species during his life, had learned to read the intention and capability of everything from massive mammoths to tiny rodents. But these creatures provided no clue that his evolutionary experience they were clearly intelligent. Yet their intelligence operated according to principles that seemed to have no connection to natural selection or environmental adaptation. They possessed capabilities that appeared to transcend their obvious physical limitations, yet showed no evidence of the supernatural made, simultaneously familiar enough to be recognizable as living being undimmed to challenge the fundamental understanding of what life could be. The confrontation began when one of the creatures raised its artificial appendage and pointed it in his direction. The movement was deliberate and threatening, though he could not immediately understand the nature of the threat it represented. His predatory instincts, honed by millions of years of evolution, recognized the aggressive intention even when its specific form was unprecedented. What followed challenged every aspect of his understanding of combat and survival. Instead of closing the distance for physical confrontation, the creature remained at range and somehow projected force across empty space. Something whistled past his ear with velocity and accuracy that spoke of deadly intent, followed by impacts that suggested the creature possessed the ability to strike a target at its far beyond the reach of Fang. The realization that he was under attack by something possessing capabilities beyond his experience triggered responses that were both rational and instinctive. Every survival in it closed the distance conveyed in the kind of physical combat for which his own enemy had imperfected over millions of years. Yet rational assessment suggested that these creatures possessed advantages that would make the tactic the projectiles, for he now understood that they were being deliberately launched rather than naturally occurring, continued to whistle through the air around him with accuracy that improved with each attempt. Whatever mechanism these creatures used to propel their weapons allowed them to strike repeatedly from distances that made retaliation impossible. Retreat became not just the wisest option, but the only option compatible with survival. Drawing upon every bit of speed and agility that millions of years of predatory evolution had provided, he began a desperate flight through terrain he knew better than the creatures pursuing him. Yet even his intimate knowledge of the landscape provided only temporary advantages against beings who seemed capable of imitation of that transcended normal physical limitations. The pursuit was unlike anything in his experience. These creatures moved differently than any predator he had encountered, yet they maintained contact with him over distances that should have allowed easy escape. Their strange projectiles continued to seek him out, even when he believed himself safely beyond their range, suggesting capabilities that made normal evasion tactics inadequate. The terror he experienced was qualitatively different from anything he had felt during his life of predatory violence. This was not the healthy fear that kept him alert to environmental dangers, nor the combat stress that accompanied struggles with rival predators. This was existential dread born of the realization that he had encountered something that operated outside the natural order that had governed his existence since birth. Everything he understood about survival, everything his species had learned about ominence and territory, everything his genetic characters saw of it seemed suddenly irrelevant in the face of these alien beings and their incomprehensible capabilities. For the first time in his adult life, he found himself in the position of prey, or rather himself in the position of prey, other than predator, pursued by Andres whose incapability of comprehend. When he finally reached the safety of his territory, his family could see immediately that something fundamental had changed. The confidence that had marked him as an apex predator had been replaced by a wariness that spoke of encounters with forces beyond his control. His account of the strange creatures and their impossible weapons was met with disbelief that gradually gave way to its physical evidence of his encounter became apparent. The projectile that had grazed his ear had left a wound him. Like anything either of them had seemed too clean for claws, too precise for teeth, too deliberate for accident. This was evidence of intelligence applied to the science of dealing death, but intelligence that operated according to principles that had no precedent in their world. That night, as they maintained vigilance over their cubs and watched the darkness for signs of pursuit, both predators understood that their world had changed in ways that could never be reversed. The golden age of their partnership, the security of their territory, the confidence of their dominance, all had been shattered by a single encounter with beings whose very existence challenged everything they thought they knew about the nature of reality. They were still apex predators, still perfectly designed killing machines operating at the peak of their evolutionary potential. But they were no longer the ultimate expression of intelligence in their environment. Something new had entered their world, something that possessed advantages they could not counter and motivations they could not understand. The age of the great predators was ending, though they had no framework for comprehending such vast transitions. They knew only that the rules had changed, that their hard-won mastery was no longer sufficient, and that the future, once bright with promise, now stretched ahead like uncharted territory, filled with threats their millions of years of evolution had not prepared them to face. The strangers had come, and nothing would ever be the same. Epilogue: The Twilight of Giants. In the vast expanse of time that measures the rise and fall of species, the story of the unnamed predator represents both an ending and the beginning, the twilight of an age when giants ruled the earth through strength alone, and the dawn of an era when intelligence would reshape the very nature of existence itself. Did not know, standing watch over his family in the fading light of his species' dominance, that he was witnessing one of the great transitions in the history of life on Earth. The encounter with the strange, upright creatures had shattered his understanding of the natural order, but the full implications of that shattering would unfold over generations yet to come. The saber-toothed tigers had ruled their domain for millions of years, perfected by evolution into hunters of unparalleled efficiency and grace. Their reign had spanned ice ages and warming periods, continental shifts and climate changes, the rise and fall of countless prey species. They had adapted to every challenge that nature could devise, overcome every obstacle that environmental change could place in their path. Yet all of their evolutionary perfection, all of their predatory mastery, all of their magnificent adaptation to the demands of their environment could not prepare them for the arrival of a species that would change the fundamental rules of survival itself. The humans for that is what those strange creatures were. Though he had no name for them, represented something unpresent in something unmillion-year history of life on Earth. They were not merely another predator species competing for the same resources, not simply better adapted creatures displacing their inferiors through superior design. They were the harbingers of a new kind of existence, one that would eventually subordinate the entire natural world of the demand of intelligence and use. Their weapons, their coordination, their ability to modify their environment rather than merely adapting to it all pointed toward a few hallucination would be superseded by technological development. The unnamed predator and his kind were not just facing competition from another species. They were confronting the end of the very concept defining existence, a world they had known, where survival depended on strength and speed and fang, where territory was claimed to combat and held through vigilance, where the only law was the ancient imperative to kill or become that world with passing away till at unstoppable spring, an unstoppable spring, passing. Yet for all the vast implications of this transition, the immediate reality remained heartbreakingly personal. A father watched over cubs who would never know the sincerity he had fought to achieve. He had fought on perfect harness and faced the prospect of seeing that partners tested by forces neither of them could control or comprehend. A family that represented the pinnacle of predatory success found themselves suddenly vulnerable to stretch down themselves as their evolutionary heritage, and now it put them at rest. The territory they had claimed, the hunting grounds they had mastered, the den that had been their sanctuary, all remained physically unchanged. Yet everything had been transformed by the knowledge that they were no longer safe, no longer capable of ensuring their own survival through strength and skill alone. There was a terrible irony in their situation that would have been apparent to any of full scope of what was unfolding. The very qualities that had made them supreme predators, their specialization for hunting large prey, their reliance on physical capabilities rather than to use, their territorial nature that made them vulnerable to coordinated group attacks, all of these evolutionary advantages were where intelligence mattered, more intelligence mattered. They were not inferior to their human successors in any meaningful sense. Their senses were sharper, their reflexes faster, their bodies more perfectly designed for the demands of their environment. Yet they were doomed by their very perfection to specialized for a changing world, to perfectly adapted to conditions that were rapidly becoming obsolete. The humans would continue to multiply and spread, their strange intelligence allowing them to limitation that constrained other species. They would develop weapons of increasing sophistication and inducing the contemplates of owing to qualities that would the entire planet according to their name and desires. Coming with not such in their immediate environment, but across the environment, but across the entire globe, saving each of the very complex and the first instance of in and in the face of this inexorable expansion, the great predators would find themselves pushed ever further into the margins of existence. Their prey would be eliminated by human hunting or displaced by human expansion. Their territories would be claimed for human settlement or agriculture. The saber-toothed tigers would not die alone. The massive ground sloths, the giant mammoths, all of the megafauna that had defined the Ice Age world would follow them into extinction, victims of the same fundamental shift that was ending the age of biological dominance. Some would fall to direct human predation, others to habitat loss, still others to the disruption of ecological relationships that had been stable for millions of years. It would be the greatest extinction event since the death of the dinosaurs. Yet, it would unfold so gradually that no individual creature would be able to comprehend the full scope of what was happening. Each species would face what seemed like local challenges, immediate threats, temporary setbacks. None would understand that they were participating in a transformation that would reshape the entire nature of life on Earth. The unnamed predator, standing guard over his family as darkness gathered around their den, embodied all of this vast tragedy in a single, magnificent form. He was still everything that millions of years of evolution could produce: strength, speed, intelligence, and predatory skill refined to absolute perfection. Yet he was also a relic, a magnificent anachronism, a king whose kingdom was passing away beneath his feet. His cubs would grow to adulthood, if they were fortunate, but they would inherit a world increasingly hostile to their kind. They might survive to reproduce, passing on their genetic heritage to another generation, but each successive generation would find the world smaller, more dangerous, less capable of supporting their ancient way of life. There was something both tragic and beautiful in their refusal to surrender, in their determination to continue living according to the ancient patterns, even as those patterns became increasingly untenable. They would hunt with the same magnificent skill, defend their territory with the same fierce courage, raise their young with the same devoted care, all while the world transformed around them in ways they could neither prevent nor fully understand. They were heroes in the truest sense, not because they achieved victory, but because they maintained their dignity and purpose in the face of inevitable defeat. They represented the last flowering of a way of life that had defined existence for millions of years, the final expression of evolutionary processes that had shaped the entire history of complex life on Earth. Their story was not unique to them alone, but representative of countless species that had faced similar transitions throughout the long history of life. The trilobites that had ruled the ancient seas, the dinosaurs that had dominated the land for over 100 million years, the countless other forms of life that had risen to prominence only to be displaced by new evolutionary developments, all had faced moments when their very success became the source of their vulnerability. Yet each had played their role in the grand symphony of evolution, contributing their genetic heritage in the innovations to the ever-growing complexity of life. The saber-toothed tigers, too, would leave their mark not just in the fossil record that would preserve their physical form for future generations of the ecosystem they had helped the species. As the seasons continued their ancient cycling, the world continued its transformation. The unnamed predator and his family would persist in their magnificent refusal to surrender to forces beyond their control. They would hunt and mate and raise their young, defending their territory and maintaining their dignity, living each day according to the principles that had sustained their kind for millions of years. They could not know that they were among the last of their kind, that the twilight of the giants was already well advanced, that the future belonged to creatures whose power lay not in fang and claw, but in the mysterious workings of consciousness itself. They knew only that they were alive, that they were strong, that they embodied everything noble and terrible and beautiful about the ancient contract between predator and prey that had governed life since prey, and had governed life since in the end, perhaps that was enough. Perhaps the true victory lay not in permanence, but in having existed at all, in having reached the very pinnacle of what evolution could achieve, in having lived with such fierce intensity that their brief moment in the vast expanse of time would echo through the ages long after their physical forms had returned to dust. They were the last kings of a world that was passing away, rulers of a domain that would soon exist only in memory and fossil stone. Yet they were kings nonetheless, sovereign in their magnificent adaptation to the demands of their time, triumphant in their refusal to be anything other than what millions of years of evolution had made them. The age of fang and claw was ending, but it was ending with dignity. The great predators would not go gently into that good night, but neither would they rage against the dying of the light. They would simply be what they were, magnificently uncompletely, until the very last moment when their kind would vanish from the earth forever. And in that refusal to compromise their essential nature, even in the face of extinction, they had a kind of immortality that transcends mere biological survival. They became legend and myth, the eternal symbol of what it means to live without surrender in a world that offers no guarantees save the inevitability of change. The unnamed predator, watching over his family as the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, carried within his powerful frame the entire history of his species and the promise of their eternal memory. He was the last and greatest of the giants, king of a diminishing realm, guardian of traditions older than human civilization itself. And in the failing light of his species' twilight, he was still, and would always be, magnificent.